Welcome back, Wanderer, to another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. Today we set sail on a journey through the realms of imagination with none other than the esteemed Chris A. Jackson. A master of the written word, Chris has regaled us with tales of high seas and daring adventures in his acclaimed Pathfinder Tales novels, and captivated readers with his vivid depictions of pirate lore and nautical escapades. But his literary prowess extends far beyond the confines of the ocean. He's also delved into the realms of apocalyptic fiction, exploring the depths of human resilience in the face of cataclysmic events. Join us as we dive into the intricacies of setting and genre, with a particular focus on the evocative worlds of pirate and sailing settings, as well as the haunting landscapes of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic narratives. I'm super excited to sit down and chat with you. I really love the work you've done. The Pathfinder novels, I read the whole series of all the Pathfinder novels. And Elaine Cunningham and Dave Gross, they're great, but I really liked your pirate ones. Those were fantastic. So
thank you. Yeah, those were a lot of fun to do.
But you've done lots of stuff since then. So before we dig into the questions and the topic of the day, which is like setting and creating settings within the genre of pirates and apocalyptic, because you've also worked in apocalyptic words, why don't you set for us the stage of who is Chris? Where did you come from? How did you fall in love with games and stories and the journey to get here?
Oh, wow. Okay, that ought to be fun. So I grew up in the south coast of Oregon. My dad was a fisherman. I kind of fell in love with the ocean through, I'm of an age. So my first introduction to the ocean was through the Wide World of Jacques Cousteau series, and I just found it fascinating. And then my dad went into fishing, and we moved to the coast, and I promptly started throwing up for 4 years on the back deck of a fishing boat. So after I'd gotten over my illnesses, sea-related illnesses, I was in high school, and I started reading science fiction, and after that, fantasy. And my last year in high school, I was introduced to Dungeons and Dragons, and it was all over. You know, I absolutely fell in love with all things science fiction, fantasy, and gaming as well. Played a bunch of games in high school and in college, to the detriment of my GPA. But after that, I really wanted to write and did not get a lot of positive reinforcement in college. Took some short story classes, and it was kind of hard to deal with, hardening my armor over the whole rejection things. And, people, especially genre-related stuff, people didn't want to read that. People wanted the great American story because you're in college. You should have outgrown that. Well, I got one for you right here.
Oh, yeah.
It's one of the... Science fiction fantasy is one of the highest grossing areas of literature out there, and I use the word literature on purpose. So, if I want to starve to death, I'll write the great American novel. Thanks very much.
Yeah. I love it. So just to bring us up to date, just to bring us to today, what are the last, let's say, 3 publications you've put out into the world? Just to give a little, what are the last 3?
So, yeah, I just wrapped up, a couple of years ago, I just wrapped up a nautical series, nautical and not so nautical, actually. Things metastasize. I always start the story one way and it goes a different direction. The Blood Sea Tales, which is my own take on the pirate protagonist character. That was a 6-book series, and I dearly loved it, and it did pretty well. And then I got a gig to write the post-apocalyptic series, the War of Souls trilogy, with Falstaff Books. And the second book in that series just came out, and I'm really pleased with how that's developing. And that was kind of a challenge for me because I'd never written the post-apocalyptic kind of thing before. But I had an idea, and I thought it was a great one. And my publisher, John Harness, really liked it, and we'll see how it goes. The one I just finished is a new high fantasy trilogy set in my own world, and it's an Asian-themed trilogy. It's called the Seeds of Darkness trilogy. And the first one is very much about a young man who's basically a son of 2 worlds. He's half Oni or basically ogre, and all the horrible things that go along with that. He has a raging temper. He doesn't understand the world, and you throw him into a completely alien environment. Basically, it's Harry Potter meets Kung Fu. And throw those two together, it was a lot of fun. And that one just came out. The first in the series is called Man of Peace. And I got a great cover by my awesome cover artist, Fiona Jade, who is amazing. And so the second and third ones are in edits and first draft form right now. So there should be a reasonably quick release on those. And I'm really, it was super fun. And talk about a rabbit hole in world building. The whole Asian themed. The first one is Chinese, the second one is Mongolian, and the third one is Japanese. But there's a lot of crossover between the three. And oh my God, I spent entire months just reading the culture. I love cultures. When we were sailing, we sailed the Caribbean literally for 13 years. And falling in love with the cultures of all these islands and how different they are and how lovely the people are and how colonialism really was so hard to overcome emotionally, mentally, culturally for so many of these peoples, and how they succeeded was so awesome. It's just changed the way I look at the world, and reading so much about the Asian themed things, especially Mongolia. I fell in with the Mongolian horse culture. Just is so enriching to read about. So yeah, don't get me started.
That's another podcast, another time.
Yeah, entirely.
You queued me up perfectly with the mentioning world building, but I want to backtrack for 1 second for a kind of a craft question that popped into my head. You said you were sailing the Caribbean for 14 years. Were you still writing them?
Yes, absolutely.
What was that like from an actual technical process point of view? What was that like?
Well, you're not sailing every day, and it's not that hard to concentrate when it's peace and quiet and beautiful, clear water and you're anchored in a little cove. And so I would write in the mornings. Generally, I wake up early and I'd write until I get tired or around noonish. And then we go do something physical, like go ashore, go snorkeling, enjoy where we are and what we're doing. And there wasn't a whole lot of stress involved other than keeping us alive. You know what I mean? There's weather to consider. There's in the environment to consider. There's immigration and customs and all these things wherever you go. And sometimes it's onerous and expensive. But all things considered, it was a great writing experience. In fact, you mentioned the Paizo novels. When I got the gig to write Pirates Honor, the first in that series, we happened to be anchored in a beautiful little cove in St. Lucia. And I wanted this gig so bad, and it came out of nowhere. Wasn't expecting to get the offer, and there was a hole in. Somebody fell out of their schedule, couldn't produce. And James Sutter, who really liked my work, I'd given him some short work, basically said, "You write fast. It's fairly clean. Your characters. How about a novel?" And when I stopped screaming in glee, because I really wanted the gig, we basically sat down, and in 3 months I had the book done. It was every morning getting up, writing until my eyes just wouldn't do it anymore, then going and relaxing and doing something fun, and then that evening reading what I wrote that morning, and then getting up early the next morning and writing again. I was putting out 5,000 words a day, just like clockwork. In fact, the rough draft took me 30 days. So 115,000 words in 30 days.
Wow.
That's the fastest I've ever written a book. But it's all about applying yourself. It's all about saying, how bad do I want this? And what else, what do I have to put on the back burner to make it happen? So that happened. So there you go.
Yep. And we have them now. That's an incredible experience. That's so cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move back to the topic of the day. Let's start general, kind of broad here, and talk about world building, as you queued up so nicely for me. When you approach the process of creating worlds, whether it's pirates and seas or it's apocalyptics or high fantasy, as you've also mentioned, what are some of the processes you use to create those immersive settings or to work with one that's already established in the case of Pathfinder? But let's focus on new stuff.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I'm kind of a character writer. Well, maybe not kind of. I'm very much a character writer. And so the way I world build is I try to look at the world through the lens of my protagonist. If I'm creating a new world, that's a lot harder. So part of the problem I have is world building is onerous, a time sink, and more than a little addictive for most creative people. you can sit there and create minutia that aren't ever going to enter your story. So as far as my worlds are concerned, my own world, I try to create what the character knows, what the character interacts with, what the character sees, and I try to avoid the big info dump of what's happening outside the character's sphere of experience and knowledge. That the way I work is that kind of thing should come from interacting with that world or other characters. I mean, if you have a character that starts out as a farmer, he's not going to know anything about socioeconomics, right? Mm-hmm. But when the price of turnips falls through the floor and he can't sell his product because there's a war on 3 countries away, now he understands it. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, there's a war? People are fighting? What about the price of turnips? And so, you kind of expand as things go out, and the world gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I've created, 6-book series. I think about 6 books is about all I can do in a series before I have to move on. And invariably, I try to start out with a small personal struggle story that you don't see the whole world. All you get more and more of it as the story goes on, as the characters develop, the world develops around it. And then by book 6, it's epic. I mean, it's world changing. It's empire crumbling time. You know what I mean? So as things expand, the characters evolve and their worldview gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's time to assassinate an emperor. Because he's really a jerk, right?
That's an excellent model. Start nice and tight on your primary character and then explode as they experience the world. Right. I like that. That's very cool.
Yeah, and that doesn't really keep you from fleshing out the world, at least reasonably well, so that you know where things are going to go and how to deal with it when you get there. But yeah, you can overdo world building up, especially if you're a game designer and you get into writing novels. Yeah, it's look, squirrels, there. So easy to do.
Indeed. Have you tried your hand at all at any game design, or do you stick strictly to the fiction side?
I've written a few things for gaming. I wrote some things for Paizo. They're like Ships of the Inner Sea supplement, things like that. But I don't have the skill set to do game design or the patience, really. I mean, there's lots of... go to Gen Con. There's more games out there than I could play in a lifetime. Mm-hmm. And even more games out there that I could write in a lifetime. So me trying to change forces and become a game designer, which is really a whole different skill set than just being a creative. You have to understand how, the math works and the probabilities work and all these other things. But having said that, yeah, I keep saying, boy, somebody should make a game that is this. And if you can think that, it's probably already out there.
That's true. Except for that one time it's not. And then...
Yeah, and then, talk to a game designer. And I happen to know a few.
I suppose you probably do. All right. Okay, well, let's move into... we'll start with pirates and sailing and that setting world. What are some of the key considerations you have to take into account when you're creating narratives in those kind of settings where there's established considerations and there's a sense of adventure and freedom and all that? What are the key considerations there?
So if you're writing pirates as protagonists, as the maybe not so good guys, but they're your protagonists, one of the most important things in just writing is your protagonist has to at least have redeeming qualities and be sympathetic to the reader. You can't write a total jerk. Now, that can be problematic when you're writing a pirate because pirates are technically violent criminals. They knock you on the head and take your stuff. So if your protagonist is a pirate, how do you make them less of a completely reprehensible character? What's their upbringing? How did they become a pirate? But you can't just lay this out. You have to kind of hint at it as you go along, and then you get more and more of the character and the setting as you go along. Do they secretly abhor violence, but they just happen to be really, really good at it? Or is it a necessity? Were they homeless and they crewed aboard a ship and they worked their way up to the top? Or are they not at the top? Are they just a bilge monkey, somebody who just is a crewman, and maybe there's a, mutiny? You can work up from the bottom, but the important thing to do is to create that protagonist who the reader will like. Now, as far as the nautical milieu entirely, that's kind of a trickier question, and I don't want to diss anybody out there, but writing nautical fiction, the first thing you need to do is understand how boats work. And it's kind of a rabbit hole, but it's not rocket science. You know what I mean? It's basic physics, and there are a lot of resources out there to make it super simple. You can't sail directly into the wind if it's a sailing vessel, right? There are certain things, the names, nomenclature's a massive rabbit hole, and nautical terminology is a language of its own, and it's easy to overdo if you really get into it. You don't want to alienate your reader by going on and on about hat harpins and baggy wrinkles when nobody knows what the hell they are anyway, right? So you have to make it clear what you're talking about without making your characters, your fictional characters, ignorant of it. You can't say, well, as you know, this line here does this. You see what I mean? You have to just say it and then pull that halyard. He pulled the halyard and the sail rose. Now you know what a halyard does. See what I mean? So, but the actual physicalness of being at sea too, you have to work on that. If you've never been at sea, you have to realize that you're not going to be dry on an open deck ship like old sailing vessel where you're going to be wet. It's going to rain. There wasn't really anywhere to be undercover. There's salt on everything, and salt draws moisture, and there's mold on everything, and food goes bad, and this and that and the other thing. There's a lot of nautical fiction out there that isn't fantasy science fiction that I would highly recommend to give you a feel of this. The Horatio Hornblower novels, the wonderful series by Patrick O'Brien, the Aubrey Mashray series, one became a movie, Master and Commander, that was the Napoleonic Wars. The audios of those books by Patrick Tull is the narrator you want to listen to, are astounding. I mean, there's 20 novels, so it's pretty engrossing. But the terminology, he doesn't pull any punches, so it's either catch up or, go home. But it's really immersive. And because he created two primary characters, one who knows really not a lot about ships, that's a sounding board that he could teach the reader a little bit more about the environment of a sailing ship. Mashran is basically a ship surgeon, and he doesn't know jack about boats. So he'll ask the questions. Why are they up there doing that? Oh, well, and they'll explain, and Mashran will go, I understood nothing that you just said. So you get to play off that. So, but there's ways of getting the point across without burying your reader in a bunch of terminology.
Smart.
Can I answer the question?
You did, actually. Not only did you answer the question, but you helped explain a lot of the tools used for building setting in that kind of genre. The internet is your friend. The internet's really your friend. But like anything else, it can be a real time sink. So yeah. Indeed. Got to balance research versus actually creating stuff.
Right. Put your butt in the chair and write something.
Okay, so on the flip side, apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic settings are often darker and grimmer, but you still need to have a slimmer of hope. There's got to be something there to pull a person through the narrative. So in your experience, your opinion as you're creating these books, how do you do that? How do you balance that?
So hope is a tricky thing. And it's something I played around with my first book and the titles are paradoxical. My first book in the War of Souls trilogy is called The Last, because the protagonist thinks she's the last of her kind. It is technically a fantasy. I don't want to get into religiosity, but she's the offspring of a seraphim, an angel. So, and there's been a war on Earth for 5,000 years, and she's been here for the whole 5,000 years. So she's 5,000 years old. She's an ageless, and she thinks she's the last of her kind. And if all the ageless are destroyed by the bad guys, the Nephilim, the War of Souls is over, and the four horsemen come by and sweep the slate clean, and we start over from scratch. But so she's been hanging around for 5,000 years, and as far as she sees, the war is all but lost. So she has very little hope, right? My other character is a street kid, so he's never had any hope. He grew up after the apocalypse happened, and so all this is the new normal to him, right? Mm-hmm. Hunger is a daily occurrence. Hope is something nobody has, right? So survival is his full-time job. And then he meets this woman who tells him, oh, yeah, this is all just, we're pieces on a chessboard. And the people who did this to the world, he said, wait, somebody did this to the world? I have somebody I can blame for this shit? Pardon me, but and that
right.
gets him. He can point his finger and say, F you. You did this to me. I'm going to kick your ass. So you see what I mean? So that gives him hope. And well, she has very little. His hope kind of gives her hope. Wait, here's somebody who has nothing, who wants to fight because he's got nothing to lose.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? When you're on the bottom, climbing up, there's only one way to go.
Yeah.
So, and things get complicated. So, but anyway, throwing a monkey wrench into the world is important into that hopelessness. To give hope is key. So you have to figure out as a writer, how can I throw a little bit of hope out there? I just watched the Fallout series, and so there you have kind of a similar thing. You have the vault dweller who knows nothing about what the apocalypse is really like. I mean, she knows it happened, but she thinks, they're going to hang out until the radiation's gone, and then they're just going to go up there and plant daisies. It's not quite like that. So having her juxtapose people who have grown up or existed through the apocalypse, whether or not they're still alive or not technically, is very valuable in having those two sides that you can tilt back and forth and really play with it a lot. Great series, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool game, too.
It was a very good game. Yeah, fantastic. All of them were great. 76 is fun right now, too. You mentioned it kind of throughout both of those answers, the importance of a character. You've talked about the characters. And so I'm curious, how do you create authentic, believable, engaging characters in settings that are so far-fetched as post-apocalyptic or high fantasy or pirates sailing with fantasy elements or otherwise? How do you create those characters? Because you mentioned how important they are. How do we make them?
Boy, that is the $10 billion question. How did Frank Herbert create Paul Atreides? He needed somebody to tell this story from who wasn't part of the problem and didn't want to be part of the solution. You see what I mean? You put someone who's basically, when it boils down to it, a regular person, or somebody who's lived through nine hells for 5,000 years and doesn't have any hope. You put them in a situation where they have to step up. You see what I mean? You can't accept defeat when the world is at stake, or your own life, or those you love, or everything you fought for your entire life is at stake. Or you find out that there is something you can fight, and you step up. How do I create these characters? I've met a lot of people, traveled a lot. Growing up in an environment of fishermen, my dad was a fisherman, right? And all these people I met, I've used their personas. All the crewmen he had who were chronic alcoholics, but the nicest people you ever wanted to meet until they were drunk and then they were violent, or people that, he had a guy running one of his boats once who didn't have a tooth in his head. Why didn't he? He was a Golden Gloves champion during the latter part of World War II, and he drove landing crafts on D-Day. He was 19 years old. And so you feed off of these people's experiences. I didn't know his life history when I first met him. I just thought he was a toothless old guy. But he could knock you out with a left jab, just slicker than... He was like 75 years old. Not an ounce of fat on his body. And so I use these people. I use these people that I've met over the years, people we've met down island or up in New England. And the scientists I've met, my real job was I was a scientist for 20-something years. And I get a lot into biology and things like that, and evolution and things like that in some of my books as well. But you feed off of all these people you've met over your entire life. And oddly, I never really take notes. I just talk to people, and if it's rich enough, it sticks in my head. Some of my best friends in the world are former soldiers, and getting into that ideal, and it is an ideal. Being a soldier is a whole different thing, and people who weren't soldiers really don't understand soldiers very well, I don't think. Understanding that, I'm talking to a Marine one time, and she was talking to me about, well, the mission comes first. And I was like, what about your people? It's like, nope, mission comes first. If your mission is to take this hill or take this wall or whatever, and you're going to lose half your people, you take that hill, which is just something that is baffling to people who don't know that environment, don't know that mentality. What am I fighting for? Well, I'm fighting for the people beside me. I'm fighting for my country. I'm fighting for, freedom. I'm fighting for a lifestyle. I'm fighting for all the things that other people don't have. You can go anywhere with that. So, yeah.
You hear that from a lot of writers, that they collect the personalities and the bits and pieces of people around them. But most of them keep it in a notebook or a file on their computer or something. All these, just all up there. That's great. It's cool.
Yeah. I'm not that organized.
I have to be, or I'll go nuts. Some people will say setting is a character in and of itself, and I don't want to get into that argument, but let's, for the sake of this, let's say that the setting of a pirate or sailing setting or a post-apocalyptic world is a set. Let's say it is a character. In your opinion, what are some of the tools you can use to bring that character to life? What are some of the sensory tools or some of the writing tools that you use to really breathe life into a specific setting?
So it's kind of difficult to get all five senses, and please use all five senses, but don't overdo it onerously. You don't have to describe how something smells when it's not important. There was a great quote, and I can't remember who said it. The color of the carpet is not important until somebody's bleeding on it. You see what I mean? So you don't have to describe every element of your setting. Unless you walk into a hotel and it's the most atrocious carpeting that gives you a headache immediately as soon as, like Dragon Con was back in the day, And so, but things like that become legendary, right? But if you walk into a hotel room and, the sheets are hard as cardboard, but they smell of bleach, so at least they're sterile, it tells you a lot about that hotel without telling you it's kind of a crap hole. You know what I mean? So for instance, being a sailor and saying writing or setting is character, you can really feel that if you have the experience of being at sea, because there's this odd sensation that the ocean's trying to kill you all the time. Maybe not all the time, but there are moments when you're convinced that the ocean is physically trying to annihilate you. The truth is, it just doesn't care.
Yeah.
You're just in the way. You're in a bad place at the wrong time. And part of being a sailor is not being in that bad place at the bad time. You know what I mean? With what they call a lee shore, the wind's blowing you onto a rocky shore. That's called a lee shore. It's the most dangerous and terrifying thing in sailing. And using those things in your environment can give your reader the feeling like, why are these people out here? Well, it's what they are. It's who they are. Growing up on the back deck of a fishing boat was, we were working 17-hour days in 40-knot winds, just soaked to the bone with very little sleep, so tired you're making mistakes with heavy machinery. And this is your life. This is your livelihood. And people do it every day. And once again, the people on shore who, are farmers or accountants don't really understand that mentality. Whereas somebody who's a fisherman doesn't really understand the farmer's mentality, that they feel like they're part of the earth and they have to always watch their irrigation and they always have to watch the weather. Well, sailors do that too. But so making your environment, for instance, a farmer once told me he could tell and this was once again back in the day, he could tell if one of his fields had to be laid fallow for a season by picking up the soil and feeling it and tasting it and smelling it. Yep. And that kind of, I don't know what criteria he was actually looking for or whether it was innate at that point in his life, but having that or just introducing that into a story is powerful. It tells the reader a lot about the people who are in that story. You know what I mean? So enrich it as much as you possibly can. One of the things I did with the pirate stories in the nautical setting is that, like I said, salt is everywhere and salt draws moisture. So you're always fighting mold and mildew on board a ship. And so the crew lives in it all the time. But the captain, he likes to keep things nice because he's the captain, right? So he has a steward who's a real character who's basically the job is to keep his things free of moisture and stuff like that. So when the captain drops salt water into his cabin, the steward's like, take off your bloody boots, things like that to the captain. It's like, oh, sorry. So it's fun to play with things like that. So
it almost sounds like it's safe to say that in a lot of situations, you convey the character of the setting through how the actual characters interact with it. It's how it impacts their lives that tell you about the setting.
That's, as I say, character writer, that's how I kind of define everything in my stories, how it affects, interacts, or, helps or hinders the character. And there are, in my new series, in the Seas of Darkness trilogy, the primary character of the first book grows up in an unbelievably harsh environment. It's so harsh that I had beta readers thinking this would never work, but you understand how it works later in the book. You see what I mean? From a child's perspective, all he knows is pain and punishment, right? And so he doesn't understand the utility of that pain and punishment until much later in the book. And he and the reader should go, okay, that kind of makes sense. It's brutal and horrible, but it kind of makes sense. See what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Smart. Okay, something came up in my brain a little bit ago, and I just want to circle back to it for 1 second. We're not here really to talk about the work that you did in Pathfinder, but I am curious, because I like to ask this of writers who've worked in IPs. What were some of the major challenges or differences you found working on a book set in an established world of Golarion?
Okay, for me, I already knew the world of Golarion pretty well because I'd been playing Pathfinder for about 4 years before I pitched myself to James Sutter at Gen Con. So that wasn't a hard learning curve for me. But I've written for other IPs that I didn't know that I had to assimilate, and that's hard to do. It's sometimes, if it's in fantasy science fiction, I can usually morph myself into it. I got pitched by a really big IP, and I had difficulty with the setting in that it was just too broad, and I kept asking the editor, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that? And so I didn't get the feedback I needed. So I finally just said, look, I just can't do this because the setting's too huge and it would take me 6 months to assimilate it to sell you a short story. So sorry, but I'm not the writer for this. Whereas if it's something that I find fascinating to begin with, I wrote a horror novella for Arkham Horror And they already had a character, Silas Marsh, the sailor, right? Of course, duh. and a basic outline of what they wanted for the story, and it's set in the 1920s. So there's another rabbit hole milieu that I found fascinating to research. And so I said, sure, it's a novella. I'm going to get paid reasonably well for this. It's going to be a beautiful little book, a limited edition, but that's all I'll ever see from this. I don't get royalties. I don't get options, things like that. But doing it was very interesting for me because I'd never written horror before. And my wife is a huge horror fan. I've read some horror, but I never really realized that, and I didn't want to prime this, but pacing is different. That's something else we're going to talk about, I think. Science fiction fantasy have a similar pacing, whereas horror has a different pacing. And we can talk about the differences. So you not only have to know your world, but you have to know your genre. As far as Golarion was concerned, I loved it. The way that worked was I pitched myself to James Sutter, and I said at the time, and talk about being at the right time in the right place. They had just put out one first year of the Pathfinder Tales, and I noticed that they didn't have any pirate novels. Cha-ching, I just done the Scimitar Seas novels.
Right.
And so I walked up to him and I said, I know you're doing stories in Golarion. Nope, there's a lot of water on your map and nobody's doing your nautical fantasy. I'm your guy. And he looked at me like, okay, what have you written? And I told him, and he thought those books were self-published at the time, but they were through a small press. But he said, send me a writing sample. And I did. And 6 months later, he's cleaning out his inbox probably. And he says, why don't you write me some web fiction? And so I did. And I gave it to him. I gave him the trifecta. I gave it to him fast. I gave it to him clean. And I gave it to him good. And so he loved it. And we were going to publish it. And then lightning struck and somebody fell out of the schedule. And he said, I love these characters. Can you write me a novel? And I was like, I am on this like butter on bread. And it was just kind of James is a fantastic editor, really eye to detail. And he gave me enough leeway to do what I needed to do. You've read those books. Celeste is primary character is a Naga. And I thought that was absolutely the funnest thing in the world because I was looking for something original to do, and I'm looking through the bestiaries. And I think the Lunar Naga was created by Mark Moreland, I think. I don't know exactly. But he came back to me later, and he said, it is so cool that you created a character in a novel based off of a monster that I created. I said, it's so cool that you created a monster that I needed for my book because she's a lunar Naga. It's all about the stars for her. So what better celestial navigator can you have on a ship who's somebody whose entire being is about the stars? And so that was just like lead pipe cinch. And then I threw romance into it, which nobody expected. And Sutter loved it. And the gamers loved it, which I was like, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So that was super fun. And I got 2 more books. Actually, you're going to cry, but I have 2 books that are left orphaned at Paizo that never got published. And they were really super good. They're still there. So maybe someday they'll decide to just throw them out. But same characters and really, really linchpin culminations to the character arcs. So, but I hope they come out eventually. But the first 3 were really, really fun to do.
And really fun to read. I hope the other 2 come out too.
Yeah.
I saw come across my news feed like early this year that Paizo was looking at bringing back Pathfinder Tales. So maybe
Well, they're going to do novels, and I know who's doing the novel, but I can't tell you. And I kind of know what the novel's going to be, but I can't tell you.
Oh, okay.
I can't tell you that it's going to be a lot more world oriented, and I hope they are a massive hit. It can only be good for everybody.
Yeah.
And I hope they market it well. That was probably the hardest thing about Paizo was they had great writers writing fantastic stories, and they just didn't get the airtime that they could have. But I tell so many people, especially new writers, writing is easy. Writing well is harder. Marketing is the real challenge, especially today. You're a grain of sand on the beach. We all are. The whole thing is making your little grain of sand a tiny little bit more shiny than all the rest of the grains of sand. So that somebody will pick you up and say, "This is pretty." Yeah.
Marketing is what I do for my day job. That's my career. That's what I've done for many decades. And yeah, it's a hard game. Speaking of which, I saw an email from Gen Con today listing the authors that are going to have tables at Gen Con, and I saw your name on there because you do marketing work.
Yeah, that is my primary source of marketing these days is conventions, and not just marketing, networking. And this is something I will tell virtually anybody who's a science fiction fantasy writer is every advance I had in my writing career came from a conversation or somebody I met at a convention saying, "Hey, you might try this," or "Hey, I know somebody," or, or going up to somebody and saying, "I'm the person who could write that book," which takes a lot of balls. And you have to, like most writers, I'm technically an introvert, but you have to get past that. You have to be able to market yourself because nobody else is going to. Even big publishers are not going to market you these days, unless you're Stephen King or, one of the biggies, which, more kudos to them. But I think their marketing dollars could be better spent priming their B-list authors into A-list authors. 100%. But that's economics, and let's not get into the publishing industry. It's really depressing.
Yeah, we won't wander down that rabbit hole, but it kills me when Stephen King has more impressions on Twitter than like every publishing house put together. So he doesn't need any marketing. He just needs to put out a tweet when a new book comes out, and he's good.
Right, yeah. But he's tweeting about a lot of things that aren't his own books, too.
That's
he
true.
tweets a lot about other people's books, which is really cool. I mean, how cool would that be to have Stephen King said, "Oh, read this book"? That's like, you have arrived.
Yeah, that would be cool. Very, very cool.
He's really a cool guy. He's a pretty amazing guy. And his about writing novel or book is spot on. He says a lot that's really critically important for the new writers, especially, to understand.
Yeah.
So,
all right, let's get back on track here. Pacing was next on my list, but you kind of touched on pacing already. You talked about the differences. Yeah. So not much more to say there. So honestly, we're kind of starting to draw towards the end here. So I kind of want to bring it all together, and I kind of have a summary here for us. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What is it that makes pirate stories, sailing stories, and also on the flip side, those post-apocalyptic, those words that I can't say stories, what makes them so enduring? Why have they last as long as they have? What makes them appealing?
So in both cases, you're fighting against something that's insurmountable. The ocean, the environment, the post-apocalypse, whatever setting you are creating. And not only are you fighting against the environment, the setting itself, you're fighting against something that else is going on. Like the Patrick O'Brien books are the perfect example. They're fighting a war on the ocean, and some of the environments they're fighting in, it's so bad they can't open the ports for the cannons because the seas come in.
Right.
It's that rough. And so, and all the things that go into that. But pirates specifically, there's that freedom thing. That's that thing that we're pirates because we're free and beholden to none. You know what I mean? We might be privateers, but we can walk away from that whenever we want. You see what I mean? So, and just being on the back deck of a fishing boat, that was the feeling there too, is, yeah, you're a fisherman, but you're your own master. You're your own captain. You can decide when you're going to go out there and risk your life. And, being self-employed, it's kind of like every day you take a day off is money out of your pocket, but you don't want to risk your life, unnecessarily. And I've been on fishing vessels in weather that is definitely dangerous enough that you're risking your life. So, and I use those experiences to what it feels like when a wave 10 times the size of your vessel hits the vessel, a broadside, and the entire ship moves 10 feet to the left, and you don't. And here comes the bulkheads.
Jesus. No, thank you. So it sounds like the universal appeal there is these stories are about man versus nature, which is obviously universal, but also man standing strong, or woman, humanity standing strong and saying, "Hey, here I am, and I'm my own person." Like that seems like a very universal theme.
Yeah, yeah, fighting insurmountable odds in an unforgiving environment, and that can be the environment can be a political one. The environment can be a social one. In my latest novel, Man of Peace, he's battling insurmountable discrimination because he's basically half ogre, and everybody's looking at him like he's a monster, right? And they call him a monster, and he's like, "No, you don't understand what monsters." It's fun to play with that a lot.
Very cool.
And the whole discrimination thing is pivotal in that book. So
that's important. Well, that brings us to the end of examining settings. So we're going to start winding up here and heading for the door, but I like to do some fun things before we head out. And the first one is, there's a question I ask everybody that comes on the show, no matter what you do, no matter what creative field you're in. And this question is, I have a pet theory that there is a magical space at the intersection of stories and games, novel writing, comic book writing, board game design, video game development, all these things where all these people can just hang out, naturally get along, shared language. If you agree with my theory, and not everybody does, but if you do, what is the magical thread that holds all this together?
And I think I touched on this a little bit, and why people like to read fantasy and science fiction and play the games in those environments is that insurmountable thing. The dragon, the ring world, the Dyson sphere, the alien race who might not think of time as we do, or might be able to violate things that we think are inviolable, like inertia or the speed of light, things like that. Encountering things that you don't understand or you don't think you can beat, and your job is to beat that, or deal with it at least, or reach a common ground. Yeah, I think that is something that really good games, I'm not talking just board games, but like role-playing games, although a lot of people say every game is a role-playing game. If I'm playing Monopoly, I'm the little dog, and I will bite you.
That's taking us to the next level.
Right. But it's that feeling of the unknown in confronting it, or the dragon who can snuff you out, and you have to deal with it. So
I like that. That's good. Okay, quick fire round. Just some quick questions just to get to know you a little better before we head out the door. What are you currently playing?
I've been playing a lot more online games because my whole gaming crew is in Florida. And so we play a lot of shooters. The Aliens series of shooters. Dying Light is a lot of fun, which is a zombie post-apocalyptic. Well, it's localized apocalypse. That's a lot of fun. World War Z. The game is actually a lot more true to the book than the movie was. And what else am I playing? Right now, I think that's just about it. A lot. Elder Scrolls Online. I have a friend in Florida who loves to play Elder Scrolls. So that's basically D&D in an open, massively multiplayer world. So that's a lot of fun. But yeah, games like that.
What are you reading right now?
Okay, I may have a chance to do some panel discussion at Dragon Con about the Expanse books. And while I watched the series, I had not actually read the books. So I'm actually audiobooking them right now. And I just finished Caliban's War #2. And I am just awed and humbled about how good a writer Maury is. He's sensational. And this is something you don't see hardly ever in series. The first book is really good. The second one is jaw-dropping. And I think it was due to that first success that really spurred him to take off the gloves and write. It's so much more emotional. It's so much deeper. The introduction of the political element, Aristotle as the Advasarala, as the character, really took things to a really next level. But every character in there is a lot more emotional. There's a lot more going on. And just a fantastic series. And I'm going to be starting the third one very soon. Can't recommend it enough.
Agreed. If your essence was perfectly distilled and then transferred into a tabletop role-playing game, what race and class would you be?
I'd probably be a human swashbuckler.
Nice. Good choice.
It's an easy guess, but yeah.
Not.
You know, I'm not really much into the violent criminal thing, but the freedom in that kind of world would be a lot. I tell people, too, that probably if I was thrown into a world like that, I'd want to be a wizard, and I'd just sit in my little ivory tower and make ice for a city, that nobody has refrigeration. So you'd be rich in a heartbeat.
Yep.
You just sell out ice out of your back door, wizard with cold spells. So, but I also have a character in my Bloodseed Tales series, and she's a reluctant necromancer. And while I wouldn't like to be a necromancer, that is a fascinating kind of a twist on magic use that I really had fun going down that rabbit hole. But yeah, I think I'd still go for the swashbuckler. Yeah.
You'd be human. You wouldn't be some sort of race that could breathe underwater and move underwater for like a water ginseng.
So, yeah, breathing underwater would really have its pluses. I did a lot of snorkeling. We still do wherever we go in warm water. But yeah, like a half mer or something like that would be fun. Aquatic elf.
There you go.
In the Pathfinder milieu would be kind of fun. Although I don't know about elves. They kind of make me nervous. The long lifespan thing would just kind of...
Yeah.
Not too sure about it like that.
Don't want to live forever?
No, I think immortality would really suck. I think life would get boring. But having said that, now that I'm, of an age, like I said, I really want more. So now maybe I change my mind.
Yeah.
I'll be an elf.
I'm not that far behind you, I'm sure. So I'm already having those thoughts. Yep.
Oh yeah.
All right. Last one, and then we can start in for the door. If you could host a game session with any 4 people from any time in history, living or dead, who would they be and what would you play?
Okay. I think we'd play either Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons or something like that. And I'd love to sit down at a game with Einstein because he enjoyed having fun. Yeah. Tesla, because his mind is so interesting. Stephen Colbert, who loves to play D&D, and Stephen King, because he's such an amazing storyteller.
That would be cool.
Yeah, those are my 4 right there.
Fantastic. Okay, we're going to head for the door, but before we do, I'd like to open up a little bit of space close to the end here. Is there anything you're working on, just came out, things you've done before that you'd like to boost, promote, mention? I'm going to have links in the comments, but just hit me with what should we put our eyes to?
The Bloodseed Tales is a complete series. It's 6 books, pirates and necromancers, and it's so fun. It's set in the opposite side of the planet from my other world novels, the Weapon of Flesh novels and the Scimitar Seas novels. And I'm writing more in that world all the time. That's the upcoming series, the Seas of Darkness. Man of Peace just came out. It's out on Amazon as we speak. And the second in the series of the War of Souls, which is paradoxically titled The First. Yeah, I'm getting weird on these titles. But that series is 2/3 of the way done. The third one is in editing right now. So, and who knows where I'll go next. I have other stuff in my own world that I might want to delve into. I'm thinking Middle Eastern flavor, Digians, and, sand and things like that. And all the associated mythos to go with that. There's another rabbit hole I can crawl into for a few months.
Cool. I can't wait to see it.
But it's always something new.
Right on. Okay, well, we're going to head for the door, but before we do, I would like to give you the last word. So do you have any parting words of wisdom for us?
I've come up with a new mantra that I tell people all the time. If you can do what you love and eat and keep a roof over your head, you have won the game of life. It's not about money, it's about pursuing what you love. Because if you do what you love really well, long enough, it can become your life. And there's nothing more fulfilling than that. So,
Well, the hour grows late, and while it pains me to say goodbye, it's time to push you out the door. Thank you, Chris, for sitting down and sharing your insights and wisdom. And to you, dear listener, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, keep creating, sharing, and exploring stories and worlds. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in the Corner of Story and Game.